Welcome to the California Sun Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. The California Community College system is the largest higher education system in the country. Oftentimes, it sets the agenda for both California's other college systems and for others around the nation. Recently, this system has rolled out new state mandates focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly known as D.E.I. These mandates raise serious questions about the very essence of academic freedom and the foundational principles of free speech. It's a complex issue that intersects with civil rights, social justice, and the role of education and professors in a democratic society. To help us navigate this intricate landscape, I'm joined by Conor Friedersdorf, a longtime California-based journalist and staff writer for The Atlantic. In his recent commentary in The Atlantic, Conor meticulously dissects the state's mandated DEI policies, the lawsuits they've triggered, and the broader implications for academic freedom and First Amendment rights. He examines the historical context, the intentions behind these policies, and why they've become a flashpoint for educators, civil liberties advocates, and policymakers alike. Henry Kissinger once said that the reason academic battles are so large is because the issues are so small. In the case of DEI in California's community colleges, the stakes couldn't be higher. It is my pleasure to welcome Conor Friedersdorf here to the California Sun Podcast. Conor, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's a delight to have you here. One of the central questions that comes out of this really is, what is the proper mission of California's community colleges? And when one looks at what it has been and what it seems to be today, they don't necessarily seem to be the same. Talk about that first.
Yeah, California's community colleges have a pretty fascinating history. They began actually as upward extensions of high schools. So almost like you finish 12th grade and you go on to 13th grade. And when I say they began as upward extension of high schools, literally it was high school teachers that were teaching the classes. It was coming out of the high school budget. It was run by the local high school principal and board. And, this was at a time when traveling a long way to a university was a big deal in California. It wasn't hopping on a plane or a train or a freeway. And so for people who wanted to get a little bit more education, they started to introduce this kind of like 13th grade idea. And at first it was just taking, a college level math class, a college level English class, something like that. And, over time, and we can talk about how this happened, but it evolved into a tremendously complex system today that is much more varied, which is to say, now this is a kind of a rung into higher education. It's kind of the lowest level of a college system rather than the highest level of a high school system. And students are studying everything from, well, again, still English and math. If they want to transfer to a UC or a Cal State college, a lot of people will do a year or two at a community college and then finish their degree at a more traditional four-year college. But other people are going to get, a certificate in HVAC or studying to be in law enforcement or a nurse, perhaps going to culinary school or perhaps it's someone who's retired and is just taking a class in photography. It just kind of runs the gambit. And so it's a really complex system with a lot to it. And, there are a lot of these colleges spread all over the state, and they're meant to serve the needs of the community. And this is why actually some of them are so different, because the needs of different communities in California are so varied.
And because the needs are so varied and because the communities that they serve throughout the entire state are so varied, the idea of a one-size-fits-all diversity, equity, and inclusion mandate seems even more absurd.
This gets into the trickiness of the governance of this system. So on one level, each of these colleges throughout the state has a local board that is elected by people at the local level. And very few people vote in these elections. But technically speaking, all of us in California who vote can have a voice in how our local community college is run. At the same time, there is a state bureaucracy that governs this system as well. And, the state has the power to mandate what the local colleges do. Now, in the case of these diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements that I write about in my article, it's important to note that what they apply to is how employees at these colleges are evaluated. So, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, it means a lot of different things in a lot of different parts of higher education. But the specific thing that we're talking about here is when someone is hired as a professor, if that's a professor who's coming up for tenure, or even if it's a staff member or an administrator at a local community college, how are they evaluated by their supervisors? What determines if they get promoted, if they get fired? And what the state has said now is that these DEI, or actually it's DEIA in this case, the A stands for accessibility. But every community college employee is going to be evaluated, among other things, on their commitment to DEIA and DEIA competencies. And so the state is mandating this, whether the local institutions like it or not. And the state is saying, here are these guidelines that explain what we even mean by DEIA. And at the same time, these things have to be adopted at the local level. And so every college has to meet the state mandate, but they might meet that mandate in different ways depending on the agreements that they come to. And we can talk a little bit more about another complicated question, which is how those agreements are reached.
And talk a little bit about the fact that it also filters down to the curriculum in some ways, because it does impact the personnel and those that are teaching it.
Absolutely. It affects the curriculum in this way. If you're a professor and you're going to be evaluated based on DEIA, it's going to change. It's going to at least potentially change the way that you teach, because part of what you're being evaluated on is your curriculum and how you present it in your classes. And it's a little bit hard to say this is exactly how it's going to affect it. But that's actually part of the problem. I've heard from a lot of professors around the state who are uncertain as to how these new rules are going to affect what they teach in the classroom. And, the term of art when we talk about free speech and academic freedom is a chilling effect. When a rule is vague, when you kind of don't know quite what it means, it tends to chill not just things that are technically against the rules, but also things that you just have a feeling that maybe your supervisor would interpret the rules in a certain way, or it could be against the rules. And, we who care about speech and academic freedom worry a lot about these chilling effects because, a rule can be bad because the things that it prohibits technically are damaging, but it can also be bad because of these chilling effects. And I worry about actually both the rule itself and the chilling effects in this case.
And talk about the complexity of some of these rules, particularly with respect to race, where this whole notion of anti-racism is very much a part of how it gets defined.
Yes, and actually I was talking before about DEIA, but anti-racism is also a term that's explicitly used by the state in these new rules and the guidelines for how they're supposed to be implemented. And, I think the average person hears anti-racism, hears the word anti-racism and thinks, well, how could anyone be, in this day and age, how could anyone be against anti-racism? Don't we all agree, or at least almost all of us agree, that racism is bad? But it happens that the state defines anti-racism in a very particular way. And it's a way that a lot of people would contest. When you read their definition, you think to yourself, well, that's not how I understand the concept of anti-racism. And, there's footnotes in these state documents, and the definition of anti-racism is actually taken from the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. It's I don't know if it's word for word, but it's at least heavily influenced by anti-racism as he describes it in this book. And of course, this book is just one of many books about racism and how to fight it that takes a very particular position that many reasonable people who abhor racism have argued with. And so the state is really taking one academic's very contested definition and saying, okay, this is the definition for our purposes, and you're all going to have to proceed as if that definition is true and good.
And this is the definition that those that are part of the system, that those that teach in the system, have to accept in order to have personal success within the system.
Yes. I mean, at least they have to pretend to accept it or to implement it to the satisfaction of the people evaluating them. And again, how exactly does that play out in practice? That's something we're going to see in the future rather than something I can tell you now. But the thing I want to underscore is it's not that there's some different definition of anti-racism or some different definition of diversity or equity and inclusion or accessibility that I think the state should adopt instead. It's rather that all of these terms, reasonable people and different scholars are just going to have different notions of what these things mean in a pluralistic, diverse society. And so, to me, imposing any one definition is actually kind of definitionally anti-diversity.
Before DEI or DEIA became this standard, there was within the community college system something called the vision for success, something much more manageable, something much more measurable that really was kind of a guiding principle. Talk about that and how far away from that we've come.
Yeah, so the Vision for Success was this kind of giant initiative. I believe it began in 2017, and stakeholders in the community college system spent a lot of time trying to decide if we wanted to improve the system, what would we do? And it's almost too complex to even talk about all the details in any one interview. We're talking about a document that's well over 100 pages. I forget exactly how long it is, maybe over 200. But one of the main thrusts of it is that the community college system is meant to serve people who might not otherwise have a chance to make it in higher education. It is supposed to be, the system is supposed to be a mechanism for egalitarianism. The idea isn't that going to college is something that only elites can do, but something that should be open to everyone. And so you start to ask yourself, how could the system better serve people who are working their way through college, who perhaps speak English as a second language, who have a home situation where taking a Zoom class is really tough because they have spotty Wi-Fi. You think about all of these different people that the community college system ought to be serving. And one of the insights that the people making up this plan had is that we have these disparities in graduation rates by race and by class. And, it's partly due to the fact that if you're someone who has relatively wealthy parents and you're 18 years old and you start off in a community college intending to transfer, if you take a class that maybe actually doesn't count toward transferring to a UC system or a Cal State system, or if you fail a class, or maybe if you sign up for the wrong class, depending on your situation in life, this might set you back a few hours or set you back a semester, but it's not going to be that big a deal. On the other hand, if you have kids and you're also working and you're also trying to get an associate degree to better your lot, having an extra class that doesn't count toward your transfer or graduation requirements, that's a big deal. And so, one of the many things that this kind of Vision for Success plan said is, we noticed that when people graduate, actually a lot of them have more credits than they needed to get their associate degree or their certificate or to transfer to a four-year college. And so we're going to try and improve the way that we counsel people. We're going to try to reform the majors so that if you come in wanting to be a nurse, maybe there's a fixed trajectory of classes that we're going to tell you exactly what you need to earn that degree, instead of kind of throwing you into the system and say, sign up for your classes, and it's a little bit more opaque about what exactly you need. So there were a lot of efforts like this to kind of simplify and streamline with people at the bottom who have a high opportunity cost of getting education in mind. And the outcomes also that the Vision for Success talked about were very specific. So it was like, we want to, reduce the number of extra unneeded credits that people have by this amount. And we want to decrease racial disparities in graduation rates by this amount by this date. And, I forget the exact details, but that was all very specific, measurable things.
It was really designed to be more efficient, to create what they call these pathways for students. A far cry from the focus on DEI right now.
Yeah. And so, there was one particular change that I thought embodied it, that I talked about in my article, where it was like, under the old kind of paradigm, it was, we want these student outcomes to change, and we're going to measure our success or failure based on whether these student outcomes improve. And under this new kind of DEIA paradigm, it's not that they've stopped caring about student outcomes, but they've layered this other kind of element on top of it, where it's like, we're going to measure success or failure by whether we have implemented DEIA principles into the system. And it just kind of assumes that implementing DEIA into the system is going to improve student outcomes. But it seems to me that we don't have enough evidence to know that.
There's no evidence to know that, and there really doesn't seem to be a clear method by which to evaluate that in this process.
Yeah, and this gets into the trickiness of a system that is both beholden to a centralized power and also decentralized in its implementation. So right now, each of the community college districts in California, and if memory serves, I think there are 73 of them. So each of these districts is going to have to figure out, okay, well, what does it even mean to evaluate our professors and our other employees based on these DEIA competencies and anti-racism? And because this is a matter of how to evaluate employees, it gets into the area where districts have negotiated in the past with faculty unions, and how employees are evaluated are built into these collective bargaining agreements. And so in each of these 73 districts, the district board or the chancellors of the different schools are going to have to negotiate with the faculty unions and come to some new agreement about how faculty are evaluated. And that new agreement is going to have to be, mutually agreed upon by management and labor, as it were, and then also sufficiently in keeping with the state's new rules that it meets the state's mandate. And so theoretically, we could see 73 different approaches across the state. I think probably we won't see that. But suffice it to say, no one really knows exactly how this is going to play out in a lot of different districts. And, to me, that's troubling in itself, that no one can give you a straight answer of like, well, how exactly do you evaluate someone based on these things? So we'll see. It's a big question mark.
And the way it plays out at Los Angeles City College, for example, is going to be far different than the way it plays out in the community college district in Orange County.
Well, you would think so. It's certainly true that the politics of the people living in these different districts is different. And I would imagine that the politics of people elected to these boards are different too. At the same time, I think that especially among administrators who have gone through education schools, who have PhDs, you see more of a monoculture than you see in the surrounding communities. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there are community colleges in relatively conservative areas of the state that nevertheless have DEI rules that are extremely progressive in their orientation, something that the voters in those districts would never approve if it were put to them directly, but that because it's mediated by, people in this particular sector that is much less ideologically diverse than the state as a whole, you're going to see some pretty interesting outcomes. And to underscore this, I wrote about 2 lawsuits that have already been filed against these new DEIA rules. And these are in the State Center district, which is in the Bakersfield area. And so, we're seeing these things in Bakersfield and Fresno, not just in Santa Monica or in San Francisco or Marin County or something like that.
And talk about these lawsuits and what the basis of the lawsuits are at this point.
Yeah. So one of the lawsuits, and the biggest one, is filed by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, a group that advocates for faculty and student free speech rights. It began actually in higher education, and now it's expanded into free speech rights in general. But this is really in that core area of academia that it has worked on for years. It represents, in this lawsuit, I think it's 6 professors from a variety of disciplines. And they're basically suing and saying, each of them has different statements in the lawsuit of here's how I feel about this. But all of them, to one degree or another, are saying, look, here are these valuable things that I do for my students in my classes and these ways of teaching that I think are effective and that work. And these new rules are coming along, and they're making me doubt whether I can do things like present diverse viewpoints or speak in ways that I'm comfortable with as a person of conscience who thinks that we ought to treat everyone the same, regardless of their race, rather than treating different people differently in the way that someone like Ibram X. Kendi would recommend in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so I guess you could kind of separate the main thrust into 2 different critiques. One is this is going to prevent me from valuable pedagogical approaches in my classroom that I've found to be effective in my years as an educator. And another claim in these lawsuits is, look, I have free speech rights and freedom of conscience and expression as an American under the First Amendment. And you're telling me I have to say and believe things that I don't believe to be true. And that's a violation of my First Amendment rights.
And those beliefs are going to be essential in the hiring process as it goes along in these places.
Yeah, this is another thread in this movement toward, I guess, injecting DEI and these ideas into higher education as a whole. And, I've written elsewhere about how the UC system at many of its campuses is posting job openings for, someone in, say, a sociology department or a history department. And as part of the job process, it used to be that this person would be evaluated on the basis of their teaching and their scholarship. But now they're starting to evaluate them on the basis of their commitment to DEI as well. And so they're requiring actually DEI statements as a part of the job application process. And some of the time they're even they're not just considering the DEI statements as part of a holistic evaluation of the professors, but rather they're looking at the DEI statements first, and they're not even considering any applicants who have a DEI statement that doesn't pass whatever their threshold is for a good DEI statement. So the community college system is a bit different in that we're not talking about having to write a DEI statement. Nevertheless, I suspect that when some of the community colleges look at this requirement to evaluate people based on DEI and hiring, a statement is what they're going to go with, because how else would you evaluate someone if they haven't taught at your institution yet?
And in some cases, it's not only the statement they want to look at, but really argue what is it you've done previously to prove that you're committed to this, as opposed to just the statement.
Right. And then when you evaluate people that way, if you decide we're going to do something in addition to a statement, or we're not going to do a statement at all because some people don't like those, then it gets into, well, so are you evaluating people based on whether they've engaged in progressive activism in the past? Because that's problematic in its own right. And so, one way to think about it is that a lot of people in our society have a lot of different notions about how to change the world for the better. And so, there might be a chemistry, a rising chemistry PhD who wants to be a professor in the community college system. And maybe this person went while they were getting their chemistry PhD and tutored kids in a low-income neighborhood, right? And maybe they even tutored kids. Maybe they speak two languages. They speak Vietnamese and English, or they speak Spanish and English. And so they went into a low-income neighborhood and they tutored kids who speak English as a second language and chemistry. And it's time that they are about to become a chemistry professor, and they put this in their job application. Now, I think that the DEI people would like this, and I like it too. I think that it's a great thing for someone to go and tutor kids. And if it's kids from historically marginalized groups, I think that that's a great thing too. But then there's another chemistry PhD student, right? And this person goes out and is really interested in curing malaria. And my God, it turns out that they make a contribution in their undergraduate research that somehow helps the process of looking for anti-malarial medicines or a malaria vaccine or something. And it ends up actually that their contribution, it's stunning. They win prizes. They save tens of millions of people over time, right? And if you're evaluating them on the basis of contributing to the good of society, this person who did the anti-malarial work is going to go in the history books. If you evaluate them on the basis of DEI, the person doing the anti-malarial work gets no credit at all, and the person who did the tutoring is the clear victor, all else equal. And, I would say that we want our institutions of higher education to have a variety of kinds of people working as professors. I have no objection to those kinds of people, including people who care a lot about DEI. There's a lot that goes under that banner that I think is good and that I would advocate for. But there's a lot of other ways to improve the world too. And I don't think that we should particularly advantage any one of them, especially when it has nothing to do with whether you happen to be a good teacher in a classroom.
And finally, you discuss in the article how this would play out, to really put a fine point on it, how this would play out in reverse if something like this took place with reverse points of view in some place like Florida.
Yeah. So, there are a lot of Americans, and if you look back, there were a lot of people who were instrumental in the civil rights movement in the 1960s who believe that our lodestar ought to be colorblindness. It ought to be we treat everyone the same. We judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And, we have Republican-led legislatures and conservative governors in parts of the country who are implementing efforts to change higher education in line with their own ideologies. Ron DeSantis is one of them who a lot of progressive academics criticize, and I've written some articles that are critical of some of his efforts in Florida. And so you can imagine someone like DeSantis saying, okay, actually, we're going to evaluate all professors on the basis of whether they adhere to colorblindness, right? And of course, the problem with that is that lots of people who earnestly abhor racism don't think that colorblindness is the best way to go about this. They think that, there are these historically marginalized groups and we have to pay special attention to them if we're going to undo the sins of the past. And again, I think it's inappropriate for a public institution of higher education to align with either of these political or ideological viewpoints. In fact, my idea of the best version of higher education is a faculty composed of people on all sides of these issues who can press one another and find the weaknesses in one another's arguments, and also expose students to different kinds of people in their classes, because Lord knows when they graduate and go into the workforce, they're going to have different kinds of bosses. If they go into political leadership roles, they're going to have constituents with diverse views. And so the kind of best thing that you can do, I think, is to select for academic excellence and also for a variety of kinds of people, for diversity of thought, and that's going to serve the system and its students best in the end.
And as you say in the title of the Atlantic piece, it's really the fundamental problem is it's a uniquely terrible way to do DEI policy.
Yeah, and I want to underscore this, that both in terms of the way that the guidelines that the state has put forth are written, which are very jargony, almost impenetrable in some of them, and also in the relationship to the law, to whether this violates the First Amendment. It's not just me saying, in my opinion as a columnist, these are uniquely terrible, although I do believe that. But, I talked to a lot of the leading organizations that defend freedom of speech and academic freedom in America. And I kind of ran by what the California community college system is doing. And, unanimously, they came back and said, oh, yeah, this is, we see things all over the country. This is particularly dicey legally. This is not the approach that we recommend. And the ACLU told me that. The group PEN America told me that. And as I already mentioned, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression now has already filed a lawsuit on the basis of these things. And so to me, when you have all of these groups, some of them left-leaning themselves, at least the ACLU left-leaning itself, are all saying this is an unusually bad thing. It ought to be something that at least academics, no matter their political or ideological viewpoints, kind of perk up and say, oh, wow, we need to look at this. This is a threat.
Do you see the state doing anything to change it?
Well, the state is certainly defending themselves in the lawsuit. They didn't say, oh, our bad, we read this and you have a good point, we're going to settle. The state has already filed some responses that contest the idea that what they're doing is unlawful. As the lawsuits proceed, it's kind of anybody's guess how this goes. But, right now, the deadline has come and gone for when these things are supposed to have been implemented in every district in the country. I'm sorry, every district in the state. Because there's 73 of them, I haven't been able to follow up and see what's happened in every single instance. But I would say that it's a moment of confusion right now because professors aren't sure what the outcome of these lawsuits are going to be. They're not sure whether they're going to be evaluated 2 years from now under this paradigm or whether it's going to be struck down as unconstitutional and they're going to be evaluated on a totally different basis.
And finally, the amount of energy that is going into trying to figure this out in these various districts is energy that arguably could be better spent in terms of pedagogy for the students.
Oh, I think so. I mean, and this is, a kind of larger point about if you have a system with something like 60,000 professors, even if the state prevails in the lawsuits, which I don't think it will, it will still be in a position of trying to force through a new system that a lot of faculty members find not only unlawful as they see it, but an affront to their consciences and their idea of what good pedagogy is. And ultimately, to me, if you want a new pedagogical approach to take hold and to succeed in any system of higher education, you're going to need to do it through persuasion rather than through, with carrots rather than sticks, let's say, because it's still going to be professors and students. Once you shut the door of the classroom, you're not going to be able to evaluate and monitor every one of these professors in every way. And if you have people who are kind of grumblingly or quietly going along just to keep their jobs, but aren't really invested in the spirit of what's going on, it's probably not going to succeed, even as you've spent a lot of money defending your right to do it.
Conor Friedersdorf, I thank you so very much for spending time with us here on the California Sun podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the California Sun podcast. I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.